Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar, Hyperconverged, Services Lead the Way to Transformation, with TBR Data Center Principal Analyst and Practice Manager, Christian Perry. I'm Justin Surgeon, and I'll be hosting today's session. Insights from today's presentation are shared from TBR's Hyperconverged Platforms Customer Research and Hyperconverged Platforms Market Landscape. If you'd like to learn more about this research, please reach out to myself or Christian after the presentation. Now, before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube channel, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit this site to watch this presentation or any of the previous webinars we've posted. Second, I'll be following up with all of you via email tomorrow afternoon with the link to the recording for today's presentation, as well as with the slides from today's presentation, so be on the lookout for that. Finally, we welcome questions from the audience. Please send any questions you have through the Q&A function, preferably not the chat function because it's easier for us to sort through on our end here, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand this over to Christian.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thanks everyone for joining today. Glad you could make it here on this Thursday. So today we're going to have an interesting discussion on services tied to hyperconverged platforms based on, as Justin said, findings from our hyperconverged platforms customer research. That's a biannual report we produce every year, and the first iteration of this research came out this summer. The next phase is going to publish next month, and actually we're in the field right now for that. So in today's webinar, I'm going to cover a range of topics, including spending trends in hyperconverged and how they impact the overall market and the ecosystem. I'll also be covering the consequences of disruption caused by the adoption of hyperconverged platforms. We'll also take a look at the return on investment expectations of customers in the market. This is a pretty interesting realm here, and it actually, the findings surprised us a bit when we were in the field conducting the surveys. This is really an aggressive market. It's an aggressive market with customers who don't have the time to wait for results. So I'll talk to that in a bit and look at the services opportunity around that. I'll also look at which services are being purchased, as well as the purchase plans of customers moving forward. This is really a massive set of research. We have 2 deliverables a year, and each one is about 200 pages. So I'm going to give you just a slice of what I can fit into this time slot, but I promise that there are some interesting findings I'll be sharing with you today. So when we look at hyperconverged, let me just set this up a bit because we see 2 basic delivery models in this space. The software delivery model includes basically all of the capabilities that you see here except for hardware and advanced hardware services. While the appliance delivery model generally includes everything except some of the software pieces you see at the top left, but keep in mind that these are business models. Most hyperconverged platforms being brought to market are a mix of these strategies, and they really include most or all of the elements that you see here. That's how these platforms are being delivered. That's what customers expect. In any case, the technology is really just one piece of the overall recipe for success. The services are critical in the market. Everything from advisory, consulting, strategy, and education to deployment and integration to break-fix, support, maintenance, those types of services. So before we jump in, let me just provide our definitions for the services here. Planning and design advisory services also, so that covers design services naturally, as well as IT environment assessment, strategy workshopping, and so on. Deployment and integration services. Here we have a bucket of hardware and software installation, hardware and software provisioning, workload migration, and so on. And then support and maintenance includes electronic support, on-site support, telephone support, parts repair, asset management, the various maintenance types, predictive and preventative, and remote diagnostics. And then hardware advanced services. That includes things like 2 to 4 hour response for on-site support, repair and maintenance, and remote managed services. So we found in our research that customers that purchase hyperconverged platforms only 11% do not purchase any services along with the technology, and we think that number could really get even slimmer over time as customers integrate more of the technology into their environments. Now, there is a part there that could prevent some purchase of services moving forward based on the skills and knowledge of customers increasing as they move forward, but I will touch on that. The opportunities really is substantial here. So we found that for every dollar customers are spending on hyperconverged technology, they're spending $1.07 on services. Now, we've seen that ratio even higher with traditional standalone infrastructure, but keep in mind that hyperconverged is generally marketed as easy to purchase, a cinch to deploy and use, and so on. It's all about, you know, ease of this, ease of that. If that was fully accurate, would customers really need all the services to go along with the platforms? It could be that customers are simply used to leaning heavily on hardware and software vendors for advisory and support. That's the atmosphere, that's the environment that we see today. But when we look at the typical profile of a hyperconverged customer, we generally see some common denominators. For those of you who have heard me talk about hyperconverged in the past, this is going to sound familiar. The typical customer here in the hyperconverged market is missing several things. The customer is missing a wide breadth of IT skills due to limited IT staff. That customer is missing a strong budget, hence the strong focus on cost savings. And that customer often is missing time, or enough time to do things that really help to produce better business outcomes. It all adds up to really a need for transformation. But customers need help, really, from the hyperconverged vendors beyond the technology itself to really understand how hyperconverged can help them arrive at those better business outcomes, and then how they can use the technology moving forward in the most efficient way from both an execution standpoint and a cost-saving standpoint as well. So the need for transformation in today's IT environments is really coming to a head. And as a result, organizations are maintaining existing IT spend and finding new funds for those transformative pieces. If you take a look here, 72% of the customers we surveyed are really doing just that. Only 17% sacrifice pieces of their other IT spend to free up new spend, while 72% of the customers we surveyed are maintaining other areas of IT spending, as you see here, and funding new hyperconverged purchases. Now, looking at that blue piece of the pie here, what we tend to find is that when new funds are allocated for an IT purchase, the services pull-through tends to be really strong because there's a strong commitment on the new purchase to begin with. These are organizations that really are convinced of the technology's value, and they want to ensure that the process goes smoothly from implementation to ongoing use, especially the buyer in the case here, which almost always is IT, although line of business leaders increasingly have an influence. We talk about that all the time, but really IT is leading the purchase here. IT wants to be a hero with a new transformative technology, and will purchase services as necessary to ensure that that hero status is cemented moving forward. So when we examine here at CBR any disruptive technology, and in this case hyperconverged, we want to understand the impact on existing ecosystems. So what we do is we ask the customers we survey if they're replacing any storage, and if they are, about 2/3 of customers are in this case, with hyperconverged platforms. What type of storage are they replacing with hyperconverged? We expected going into the field earlier this year that there would be an impact to SAN storage now and over time. But really, we expected that to be more of a long-term trend as hyperconverged moves into larger organizations because, yeah, we see this primarily as a play for SMBs, remote offices, branch offices, and it is moving up into the mid-market. But that displacement, that SAN displacement, as you see here, is happening right now. It's also happening on the NAS and DAS sides. Bottom line here really is customers are forcing disruption into their environments. It's done with good reasons, like increased complexity, increased costs as customers try to scale those aging storage architectures to meet increased business demands, increased data demands, increased amounts of data. But that process of forcing disruption into the environment in order to solve some of these other challenges, that could spell disaster if the implementation is not right. And if it isn't right, and IT is on the hook for a disastrous purchase, you can forget about customer retention. This is another reason why services are just so critical right from the start of a hyper-converged engagement. So again, about getting it right from the start. So check this out. 41% of customers we surveyed expect to achieve a positive return on investment within 1 year. That's really aggressive. We don't doubt the customers will recognize substantial benefits in their environments from the integration of hyperconverged, things like more effective management over internal processes, more streamlined management, faster time to deploying new workloads, and so on. These are the things the customers are telling us that they're looking for with hyperconverged. But positive ROI is a much bigger picture. These are customers who don't want to wait for IT and business transformation. They need it now. Again, this is where services will help to set expectations. So customers can clearly see, once they've deployed, the time to expect that positive ROI. After all, it's really difficult to mimic a full rollout in the testing phase, as we all know, and that becomes even more complicated in larger environments. But a close, really services-led engagement after deployment, and of course those services are needed up front as well, but that engagement after deployment will ensure that customers remain realistic with their expectations moving forward, that they'll remain realistic with expectations around ROI moving forward, because you don't want to come up against that year mark, that 1 year anniversary after a hyperconverged rollout, with the customers looking at you and saying, hey, we're not seeing our ROI here. What's the deal? Because you promised this, you promised that, and we're just not seeing it. However, again, those expectations can be set up front, or some expectations can be set up front, and then ongoing as the customer gets the hyperconverged platform up and running, integrated with the rest of its infrastructure, then the expectations can be modified over time. Because again, it's really difficult to gauge what the actual implementation will be until it goes live, and there's always a danger there. Again, the services and that deep connection, that deep engagement will help to prevent some of that, some of those challenges. So what services are customers buying? This is just a tiny sampling of the services we examine. We look at a whole host of services, and we ask customers, which ones are you buying? Why are you buying them? What's most critical for you in your environment? But look how many customers are purchasing those services that are directly tied to transformation. 49% are purchasing integration and implementation services. You see 40% purchasing advisory and related services, and then 38% buying education and certification services. Really, again, customers are willing to lean on vendors not only for the technology here. They want the entire experience. Although we see a lot of customers initially deploying hyperconverged for a very particular use case, such as VDI or video surveillance, it's very apparent to us that they need a new type of infrastructure to do new things, or they need a new type of infrastructure to do existing things better, with better performance and at a lower cost. But it really has to be done right. They're willing to pay to ensure that. Now, we've seen this trend happening over the last 2 to 3 years on the converged side. So, we kind of expected it there, just as we would with any emerging technology. We saw it with cloud, for example, where, a new way of doing things, in this case, or in the case of converged systems, an entirely new architecture, and early on in the days of converged, a new management interface. Although now we have single pane of glass management across traditional standalone architecture as well, thanks to that influence from converged. But customers early on there were purchasing a lot of services because they, A, they wanted the implementation to be right, and B, they needed help understanding how to use it and how it was going to benefit the business. Because, especially on the converged side, those are very expensive purchases compared to hyperconverged. Although there are still concerns with hyperconverged that, it's a little bit pricey up front. But again, that's compared to, standalone infrastructure purchases. So when we got to hyperconverged this year and looked at what customers, what their buying patterns were here, we actually expected the services the service purchases to be a little lower than what we saw with converged, because there is that level of awareness and knowledge and skills that have increased over time around those types of platforms. However, the services being purchased, the level of services is just as strong with hyperconverged. And really, when we, along with the online surveys, we conducted a whole host of very deep phone interviews as well with customers on a global basis. And when we did that, we found that, the buyers do have some level of familiarity with this type of infrastructure, especially on the converged side. But they do not want to take any chances whatsoever. So they will purchase whatever the vendor can offer in many cases to help ensure that they don't screw up that implementation, because especially when you're talking about smaller customers, so SMB customers or those on the lower end of the mid-market, in many cases they're replacing big chunks of their IT infrastructure. So, because when you're dealing with smaller customers, even though these platforms are going in for a limited number of workloads, or even just one workload, let's say VDI, it might just be the focus of their business, whatever they're deploying it for, especially, something like video surveillance or, something with graphics or so on. So, they want to, they bought the line from the vendor, and by the way, yes, there is a lot of hype in this market, but vendors are delivering on that hype because customers are satisfied. But the services is a big piece there, because they're walking hand in hand with that customer all along the way to ensure that satisfaction is strong. So what's next for hyperconverged? Pretty easily put, more purchases. What you're seeing here is a reflection of the entire hyperconverged experience, and not just the technology itself. Customers are happy, and I mentioned that. Satisfaction is really strong. They like what they see, and they're willing to spend more. Now, and I've talked about this before, and we've seen it with converged infrastructure, there is what we call a new car smell. You buy a new car, and that's the only time that you experience that sort of smell, and you equate it to something that's new and exciting. That same experience happens with infrastructure. We talk to IT buyers all the time, and you can just sense it. It's palpable. that level of excitement when something new comes into their environment. And, this isn't just a new brand of x86 server or, a new NAS filer. This is a whole new box coming in that has everything. And, it's really changing the game for virtualization. It's changing the game for storage management. It's really changing the perspective of buyers in the market in terms of how they manage their data. And so, there is that level of, hey, this is great, let's get more. But, if you look at this, this shows customers who are willing to invest more in the next 12 months alone, let alone ever again in the future. These are customers who already purchased Hyperconverged. And those 26% you see at the bottom there in the red, those are mostly customers who are adequately provisioned for the next year. They're not unhappy. We encountered very few unhappy customers with Hyperconverged. Now, over time, are we going to see levels like this in terms of planning to buy more? I think it'll start to decline a bit for a couple of reasons, because A, customers will simply have more of the infrastructure in their environment. They won't need as much. Now, but on the other hand, if the infrastructure is going to help lead to better business outcomes, say, faster time to market with products, more efficient, quicker communication with customers, and leads to more impactful business outcomes, then those businesses are going to continue to grow and they're going to continue to need more infrastructure. We're in the early stages here. Yes, there have been vendors in the market that have been here for many, many, many years, but we're still in the early stages compared to the overall adoption of all IT infrastructure, and in particular converged infrastructure. It's still just a smaller slice of that market. There's a lot of room for growth. So, those promises around, those better business outcomes, as we call them, some of them remain to be seen what if they come to fruition over the long term. Services not only ensure smooth integration and more likelihood that the technology can ensure better business outcomes, but they keep the engagements moving, especially those transformative pieces I mentioned before. If the advisory, for example, if the advisory is ongoing, as customers use the platforms and get used to relying on Hyperconverged to run their business, then the vendor will become a trusted partner around the entire transformation of that organization moving forward. That's big, especially when you're talking about smaller customers, and that's the bulk of customers in this market right now. And of course, if the customer's business grows, you can then be side by side with the customer alongside that growth. And with that, I think we're going to open up the platform to Q&A.
And so just a quick reminder, please send any questions you have to the Q&A function of the chat function. It's just a lot easier for us, excuse me, a lot easier for us to sift through them on our end here.
Thanks, Justin. So first question. In your customer research, are you getting information on how much customers are relying on value-added resellers and SIs to provide these services instead of the vendor? Yeah, actually, we do look at that. We look extensively at the route to market that's occurring in Hyperconverged, and we are finding, although I don't want to say a bulk of the engagements are direct, but many engagements are still direct to this point, but that's changing. Actually, what's interesting is that for the initial evaluation of Hyperconverged platforms, customers go about evenly to the channel and then direct for information about Hyperconverged. So that's opportunity there to engage channel partners to at least provide information about the platforms, but better yet, to actually deliver. So, this is, and as we've seen in Converged, this is something that's very, very channel friendly, especially something that's delivered as a solution, a pre-engineered solution. But on the other hand, when you have so many use cases emerging, it can be a bit challenging to educate channel partners, especially as use cases are emerging as rapidly as they are. Because what we find is that customers tend to discover use cases in their environments that they hadn't originally intended. And there's, we have a lot of research around that, and it's interesting. Once those come out, they want the vendor to be able to help them exploit that opportunity around a particular workload or a use case, because naturally they want to get the biggest bang for their buck out of that purchase. So, in any case, yes, channel is in the mix for sure. And I think it's going to be even larger in the mix moving forward. Next question. What level of adoption do you see in large enterprises versus SMBs? We actually, so we had what we call natural fallout when we went into the field. We targeted a minimum customer size of 250 employees. But what we, and often with other areas of infrastructure research, we'll go with a minimum of 500 employees or even 1,000 employees. But we wanted to make sure that we capture smaller customers. But what we found was that, we easily found a bunch of enterprise customers, those with 1,000 employees or more, using Hyperconverged. That surprised us a bit. I think that just reflects the rapid accelerating adoption of Hyperconverged. In those cases, those customers in larger enterprises that are using Hyperconverged, and again, we still see this as a sweet spot for SMBs and the mid-market, but those using it in larger organizations are using it, for a very, very, very select group of workloads. So, those, like VDI, again, video surveillance, whereas what we see in SMBs is that they're adopting, all of their virtualized enterprise or virtualized workloads, or typical enterprise workloads across Hyperconverged. So things like Exchange, SQL Server, Oracle. So, and to be able to migrate off of existing infrastructure, a wealth of workloads like that in a large organization, it's naturally, it's harder, it's more complex, it's more time consuming. So we see that happening now on the SMB side. Next question, how do you think things will change in the future for purchase services? I think for the short term, the next year to two, that the services that we see being purchased will tend to be the same services being, those that we see being purchased now will be the same services purchased over the next year or two, because I think that the level of customer awareness and understanding and skills around Hyperconverged is still growing, and there's a lot of room for growth. So, none of the typical, break-fix support or some of the advanced hardware services, I don't think those are going to change at all. Those are very strong in terms of purchase. Those will continue for the long term. But the advisory services, strategy, consulting, education, those are still going to be very high up on the priority list for customers moving forward, in that short term, 1 to 2 years. Beyond that, that could change because, customers gain more awareness and skills. At the same time, the beauty of Hyperconverged is that, at least selling Hyperconverged, is that these, again, are customers who don't have the resources to lend to a real deep sort of, investigatory process around what Hyperconverged can do for their business moving forward and long term. They're leaving more and more of that to the vendor to help them understand those things. Especially when you're talking about smaller customers. Some vendors in this space, especially some of the pure plays, they consider their ideal customer to have one IT person on its staff. So, keep that in mind as this market develops. We expect that those types of customers are still going to be, even 5 years from now, those are going to be ideally targeted customers for Hyperconverged. However, as this market evolves, as the technology becomes more capable and more scalable, it's going to move farther up the chain in terms of customer size. Next question, why do customer decision makers prefer professional services from vendors and SIs? Are they also using IT consulting firms such as Accenture or Capgemini? What's the criteria for engaging these different forms of technical or advisory guidance? So why we see customers using primarily vendors and SIs and VARs for at least in these early days, consider the customer size. The SMBs aren't generally dealing with Accenture or Capgemini. Now, yes, we did capture quite a few customers from large enterprises. However, what we found, I think that there's a perception that those big IT consulting firms, are still consulting more around traditional infrastructure and converged infrastructure, of which we consider Hyperconverged a subsegment. But this is still emerging, and frankly, the vendors, especially the pure plays, and some of the OEMs as well, including HP with Store Virtual. Those, and when I talk pure plays, Nutanix, SimpliVity, Pivot3, Scale Computing, Maxta, Atlantis, GridStore. There's a bunch of them. Those are the experts in the market right now, and those are vendors that, again, they're pure plays. They understand how to engage with customers, and by the way, their marketing is exquisite. And when we look at the marketing of other types of data center infrastructure, it can be really difficult to navigate. You're talking a whole bunch of speeds and feeds now. The OEMs have gotten away from that a bit, and they're talking more to the business outcomes. But Hyperconverged has really done that right from the start. So to justify purchases today, you really have to show the benefits to the business, and Hyperconverged vendors do a good job of doing that right up front with the marketing. Now, when customers see that, that's who they're going to want to engage with. Now, I do think that'll change over time as the Accentures and Capgeminis get more experience with these types of deployments. But because of the customer size right now, I don't think it's quite ideal for them to be able to capture those engagements, or even possible right now, simply because those customers aren't using Accenture and Capgemini. Next question, do you see the need for vendors to decouple their Hyperconverged software and license that separately from their proprietary hardware platform to facilitate reuse of existing computing assets for disaster recovery or backup infrastructure? Yes and no. So most of the Hyperconverged software that we see out there is developed by pure plays, and they're partnering with hardware with hardware vendors in order to go to market because they don't manufacture their own hardware. So by design, much of this software can technically be used with existing hardware platforms. But that's not, it's not, from the customers that we talk to, that's not really an ideal way to deploy the software because there are so many, part of the reason that customers are moving to Hyperconverged is because they have so many complexity issues with their existing infrastructure due to scaling out as, the data keeps piling into their organizations. That's one end of the spectrum. The other is if they're looking for, very particular use cases, such as disaster recovery or backup, I think that having that ability to, if it's not already decoupled, although I think in most cases it already is, and I'll use this example again with Store Virtual. That's something that, is, can be delivered in appliance fashion or not. But let's say for the sake of argument that there is software that's not decoupled currently in a Hyperconverged appliance. Is it worth the effort, worth the engineering effort and R&D effort to decouple that and offer it as a standalone piece of software? Yes, I think so. But keep in mind that customers expect that the price that they're paying for a Hyperconverged appliance is almost entirely for the, for the value of the software, because, there's a perception that Hyperconverged is delivering more, pure commodity hardware. And the value is not in the hardware, it's in the software and what the software can do for that hardware. So, and you mentioned proprietary hardware platform. That's not really how customers that we've seen are looking at Hyperconverged. They're looking at it as proprietary software platforms. Next question. As customers gain more skills and knowledge with Hyperconverged, will they still need services? That's a good question. There's I think a certain segment of customers who will, and we see this elsewhere too. We see it with cloud, for example. As customers, especially larger customers, develop the skills internally, they'll take on more of the, the support functions themselves. They'll bring it in-house. But, again, a big value proposition behind Hyperconverged is, the time savings in the face of limited resources, and the cost savings as well. So, if a customer purchases and deploys Hyperconverged on the premise that it's going to help with cost savings, and that's a big driver behind that initial purchase, they're going to continue to buy services, because if they bought the services up front and they see cost savings from the architecture as a result, things are working as designed, and they will continue that model. They will not want that model to break by attempting to do some of the, some of those services themselves. Now, where it could change, as I discussed earlier, is more of the advisory and consulting and strategy. That could absolutely change over time. We expect it's going to change over time, at least on, with larger customers. With smaller customers, as their businesses continue to grow, they're still going to need that help. And vendors in this space now are only going to become more adept at helping customers along that transformative journey. I believe that's the last question on the docket, Justin.
Yep, I think that's all we got. So I'd like to thank you, Christian, for your time today, and thank you, everyone, for sending in your questions and for your attendance for today's presentation. You can follow Christian as well as TBR on the Twitter handles listed here, as well as our SlideShare pages and YouTube pages, so please check those out for our previously aired webinars. As a reminder, I will be following up with all of you tomorrow afternoon via email with the link to today's recording, as well as with the slides, so be on the lookout for that. Before you sign off, we'd like to ask you to take a very brief survey. It should pop up automatically. We do read the results from this survey, and we're always looking to improve both the information we provide and how we provide it, so your feedback is greatly appreciated. We'll leave the chat function open for another minute or so for people to ask any last-minute questions. Otherwise, thanks for attending, and have a great afternoon.
And if any questions do come in, or if we missed any questions, I don't believe we have, but we'll go through the list again. We will certainly follow up offline.
Thanks. Have a good one.